Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for participating in our today's lecture, Foodways of the Past. We're joined by Dr. Justin Nordstrom. Dr. Nordstrom is a professor of history at Penn State's Hazleton campus, where he teaches surveys of U.S. and world history and classes on American food history. His research examines American history by studying popular text, demonstrating how media shaped Americans' individual and communal identity from the 19th century to the present. Related publications include Aunt Sammy's Radio Recipes, the original 1927 Cookbook, and Housekeeper's Chat. And he is the editor of Provisions of War, a global history of food and warfare. So thank you, Justin, and we'll get started.
Wonderful. Hey, thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate it. I'm going to try to share my screen. And all right, so now you should see a bunch of boxes. And then if I could do this. All right, so give me a thumbs up, folks, if you can see my title slide. Just says food. Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right, wonderful. Right, so I don't know about you, but if I think back to my first history class, I was probably in elementary school. Nobody ever mentioned food as a topic. For me, history at the start was memorizing the dates of battles and presidents, and that might kind of match your early exposure to U.S. history. But I'm going to argue today that food does count as history. If you miss everything else I say today about uh, Herbert Hoover and the U.S. Food Administration, take that away with you. The idea that food counts as history. And the famous writer, best-selling author Michael Pollan, he's argued that eating is a political act. And I think that really could be the summary of what I want to talk about today. The idea that food can inform history and likewise historical change impacts the way we eat. So here's where I want to get started. I'm not just going to be like a floating head talking to you on a computer screen. I want you to be able to participate. I'm going to give you 1 minute and post in the chat, if you don't mind. Post in the chat, what's your favorite thing to eat? Yeah, this is about what I get when I ask my students. Okay, I've got 1 vote for French fries and pizza. Nice, okay. What do we got here? Oh, very nice. Okay. Awesome. I think if you had 10 different cooks, they would give you 12 different jambalaya recipes. So that's one of the things I love about it. That's great. Matt, are you from Louisiana or you just really like it? No? You just, okay. I mean,
No, it's one of my favorite things that I've had. Like when I first started exploring new foods, I guess in college, that was immediately was just delicious. And so
I
whenever I
love
see
that.
it,
Yeah, that's fantastic. Um, all right. Any other votes? Not going to belabor this. Nicole was like, people are joining on their lunch break. I'm not going to, you might have even had Cheerios and ice cream at the same time. Tina's like a huge, just a font of foods, right? French fries, pizza, Cheetos, and ice cream. Maybe all in the same meal. This is awesome. I love it. Anything breads, Nicole? I love that too. I used to, I had got this idea, like everyone else during the pandemic, that I was gonna like make sourdough starter, and I realized that's more like having a roommate than I just took over my whole countertop. I had like 17. So my favorite food is okay. All right, I'm gonna switch gears. Let's say we'll do this one together. Let's say that we as a group were assigned by a restaurant to create the all-American meal. Okay. Post one thing in the chat that you would want on the menu for the all-American meal. Give me like one thing. What would be one menu item for that? Okay, cheeseburger, right? Burger, right? That makes sense. I think all of Tina's favorite foods are in the all-American meal, personally. Cheetos, like ice, oh, an ice cream float, interesting. Okay, I like it. I like it. Yeah, this is kind of weird, but one of the foods that the rest of the world that we eat, all the time, that the rest of the world doesn't get, is root beer. That's a distinctively American thing for some reason. So here's my favorite food. Any idea what it is? Give it a shot, Maddie.
Sorry, there we go. Kimchi.
Yeah, it's kimchi. It's fermented vegetables, especially Napa cabbage. It's distinctive of South Korea. I've never been to South Korea, but I have this food all the time. I love kimchi because I have it on everything. Um, my eggs in the morning. This is grilled cheese and kimchi. It's very good. I've made my own kimchi in my kitchen, and man, that's a ton of work. So I'm not going to do that again. Now I just buy it from a jar. But I will say, so this is me eating kimchi. Where am I in this picture? The sign in the background is your hint. So I'm in Paris, right? So here I am, like a guy from Pennsylvania. I'm eating this food from, Eastern Asia in Paris. So that's part of what I want to talk about today is how, and plus it's an embarrassing picture of me. I love that. Um, I think you're all exactly right. When I go traveling and I ask my Uber driver, "Hey, where should I go for lunch?" They invariably point me to some kind of fast food restaurant, and I used to think, they could tell from my voice or the way I look that I'm American, and so they just want to, have me go someplace that's familiar. But I've actually I had a cab driver in London that said, "Oh yeah, you should go here to this fast food place." And then I noticed 5 minutes after dropping me off that that's where he was having lunch. So part of it is just this is where people go. But part of it is I think you're all right. Um, Burgers and fries, or maybe Tina's favorites, ice cream and Cheetos. These are distinctively American. Um, but what's even more American is not the ingredients, but the volume of food. I think one of the things that makes it the all-American meal is that whatever it is, it's supersized. So whether it's corned beef and cabbage on St. Patrick's Day coming up in a couple months, or the hard shell taco. These things were not from Mexico or Ireland. We associate them with those places. They're actually created here in the US. Um, but more than that, the portions, the overwhelming aspect of food is quintessentially American. This is the cornucopia, the horn of plenty. And we know that from the earliest European explorations that people have associated America with abundance. European visitors would write letters home before and after the revolution, and they would say, "You are never going to believe the breakfasts at American hotels." And there's kind of this tradition. This is two famous food writers, Etta Madden and Martha Finch. They said food has primarily been a symbol of American abundance. And in his first voyage, doesn't come to what will become the United States, but he travels to the Caribbean. And Christopher Columbus said, "This is the Garden of Eden." And William Bradford, the head of the Massachusetts Bay Colony Pilgrims, he compares the Plymouth Plantation, which was on the verge of starvation for years. He still says this is like the land of Canaan. A little bit later on, Hector Saint Jean de Crèvecoeur, this is the 1700s. He says that this is a place of rebirth. He says where every immigrant can be fed. Going all the way back to the earliest European visits to the New World, there's this connection between abundant food and an almost religious or spiritual identity. Almost as if to say that the sheer abundance of food in America could only be a kind of supernatural blessing. Crèvecoeur says this, he says, "The immigrant loves a country where everything is so lovely, where instead of starving, he will be fed." This idea of American food abundance, this was even prevalent before most Europeans could even find America on a map. This is from a painting, late 1500s, and it's called The Land of Cockaigne. If we had more time, I would go into great detail and I'd have you all tell me what you noticed about this painting, but it comes from a medieval poem that begins, "Far out to the sea and west of Spain, there is an island called Cockaigne." And it imagines a place with no work, where everyone, like the folks you see in the painting, can just lounge around in a giant food coma. Every day is like that afternoon after your Thanksgiving dinner, right? Where you loosen your belt and just, wallow in all the food you've eaten. Cocaine, you can see in the upper left corner, that's with all those circles. Cocaine was said to be so abundant in food that people built their houses out of pies. And on the right side of the screen, you can see there it looks like a pig. You might not be able to tell from the picture, but there's a knife sticking out. Cocaine was a kind of magical place where if you were ever hungry, you just needed to open your mouth and fully cooked birds would fly in and you just had to pick out the bones. The pig that you see there was a kind of magical creature which was fully cooked. It would walk around fully cooked with a knife sticking out. So if you ever wanted a snack, you could just carve off a piece. And that was the idea of this place. So it was this magical place west of Europe where everyone was, abundantly fed. One historian of American food, Hasia Diner, has said, preparing and consuming food together solidifies social bonds. But maybe a better way to put that is the word companion. If you looked up like the literal origins of that word, it translates to someone you share bread with. And so the idea that companionship or community is linked to food that we share together, I think that's really what I want to talk about here. We might define a community as a group of people that eats together. Okay, so here is your opportunity. Helen's gesturing to me. Helen, what's going on? You can unmute yourself. You need me to go back, Helen? You need me to go back to this? Fantastic. All right. Helen, this is all recorded. You don't have to write it down as I'm speaking it. We can send you the recording. You with me? All right, I'm going to press on. Okay, so somebody tell me, you can either unmute yourself or post it in the chat. What's one thing you had last Thanksgiving? It wasn't that long ago, folks. 2 months. What'd you have? Here's what we got. Mashed potatoes, Tina. Tina probably had mashed potatoes with like Cheetos on them, which would be great, I think. Sweet potatoes, says Maddie. Okay. All right. Yes, you would. I would too. Okay. So almost everyone, I think I read a statistic, like 90% of Americans eat turkey on Thanksgiving. You had kimchi for Thanksgiving, Tina? Man, I want to go to your house. We didn't have anything like that. The original Thanksgiving meal, way back in 1621, this was a meeting between Wampanoags and early English-speaking settlers. The original meeting was much, much smaller. We know from one letter, that's all the evidence we have about the first Thanksgiving. One letter says they had venison, waterfowl, which I guess might have been turkey, but not necessarily. And we know that the pilgrims exercised their arms, meaning they shot off their muskets to try and intimidate the natives. Did they have turkey? Maybe. They probably had a bunch of other, say, shellfish, like oysters. That was pretty common. Maybe clams, maybe lobster. These were common foods for the early settlers. The point is that the way that we experience this historical memory of Thanksgiving is very different from the actual historical event. And so one other point that I want to make today is that the meanings and foods that get associated with events, that this changes over time. One historian has kind of speculated that this might have been closer to the actual menu, right? That we might have had corn, or what the pilgrims would have called Indian corn, the multicolored corn, squash, nuts and berries, maybe codfish, eels, and because they didn't really have ovens the way we think of it, maybe they would have been baked over a hearth into pies. And so it would have looked very different from what we see here today. Or what we see in the famous Norman Rockwell poster. This is the Freedom from Want poster that was circulated during World War II, with the big turkey as the centerpiece of the family. But what I want to talk about today is actually a kind of historical crossroads. I want to talk about food, not and the, say, early American history, but a later episode of history. We're not too far removed from the 100th anniversary of the First World War, which breaks out in 1914, and officially at least comes to a close in 1919. The Great War, as it was called, is, I think, a kind of national blind spot for Americans. Several years ago, the last surviving American soldier of the First World War, Frank Buckles, died. And so we don't have any more living soldiers, any more doughboys from World War I. And I say it's a crossroads of commemoration because, I'll have this slide towards the end today, but we've had monuments to other conflicts, World War II or the Vietnam War, um, even the so-called forgotten Korean War. We've had that for a very long time. And uh, the National Park Service is, even as we speak, only now finishing the First World War Memorial in DC. So in a way, even though it's a little bit older, there's less contemporary memory of the First World War. And so in a sense, that matches what historians have described about this conflict. If you read 100 history books on the First World War, and there aren't 100, there are thousands, you would get multiple perspectives, not only on the events, but also on the overall meaning of the war. Maybe the most famous historian of all to look at this event was Barbara Tuchman, and she has called the First World War the March of Folly, or an example of a March of Folly. John Keegan, another military historian, called this a great European tragedy. Historian A.J.P. Taylor said that the First World War was no glorious victory, only wounds and death. And so these are very pessimistic views and different from how we remember other conflicts. On the other hand, you've got historians saying the exact opposite. Historian Hugh Strachan has said it was emphatically not a war without purpose. He's arguing that just like we might remember, say, the US Civil War or World War II as wars that had an important message, an important outcome, we should think of that as the way that we commemorate, the way we remember the First World War. So my point in bringing up all of this is that historians, just like the general public, don't agree about the overall meanings of historical events. But I would argue that even though it is not remembered in such vivid ways, if I stopped 100 people on the street today and I asked 100 Pennsylvanians, give me the name of a Civil War battle, I would say that more than half, maybe 2/3 or 3/4, would be able to come up with Gettysburg or Antietam Creek or something. But if I stopped that same 100 people and I asked them, give me the name of a battle in the First World War, I would guess that maybe less than 10% would tell me the Somme or something like that, the Battle of the Marne. I don't think I would get the same kind of response, even though this is a more recent conflict. Nevertheless, the First World War changed almost everything about Americans' daily lives. During the First World War, Americans changed the way they printed newspapers and the way they paid their taxes. They changed the ways that they communicated with each other. They enacted a whole bunch of censorship laws, regulations in trade, in shipping, in business, in labor, everything, even the way Americans tell time. Today, if you ask people, say in March, why we're going to change our wristwatches, they would probably say, oh, it has something to do with farmers. It has absolutely nothing to do with farmers. When's the last time you said to a farmer, yeah, you know what? I would go, normally I'd milk the cows, but I'm not going to milk the cows because it says my wristwatch is telling me it's an hour different. That doesn't make sense. The reason we have daylight savings time today is the First World War. Some number cruncher, some statistician in Germany decided that it would be a way to save on oil and kerosene, light fewer lamps. And when America enters the war in 1917, they think, well, if it's good enough for Germany, it's good enough for us. So the US implements daylight savings time in 1918. And we've never gotten rid of it, although, frankly, I hope we do. Philosopher John Dewey talked about what he calls the social possibilities of war. And during the war, there's this tremendous mobilization of people and changes in Americans' daily lives. The US implements national income tax as a constitutional amendment during the war. Americans implement women's suffrage under Wilson during the war as a wartime measure. And so tremendous aspects and things that we still do every day, every April 15th, twice a year when we change our clocks. This all comes as a legacy of the First World War. But I think that the biggest change to American life during the First World War was how Americans fed themselves. All right, who knows who this guy is? From West Branch, Iowa, a vilified president. Give it a shot, Maddie.
What? Oh, well, Tina says Truman. Is Tina correct?
No,
Okay.
Americans have a more
Is
positive
it?
vision
Yeah.
of.
I was also going to say, is it Hoover? But
Yes, this
Richard
is
got there
Herbert
first.
Hoover, right? Exactly right. We have to wait a little bit until we get to Harry Truman. Yep, this is Herbert Hoover. I guess they share one thing in common. They're both from the Midwest, so Tina, you're not that far off, and they both only have one. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that they're remembered for one thing, right? That's basically it. Like Truman, like the atomic bombings. This guy, Herbert Hoover, the stock market crash. But before he becomes president, Herbert Hoover's first role in American public life, he's an engineer, right? But he starts this drive first to collect money and then to accumulate food during World War I. When America enters the war in 1917, Herbert Hoover is the U.S. Food Administrator. And his slogan, it's not the most imaginative slogan, but it's really successful, is simply, food will win the war. Americans are told to dramatically produce more food. American farmers are told to produce an overabundance of food. In time, this is going to lead to ecological problems like the Dust Bowl once Hoover takes office. But Americans were also told to scrutinize, even do a little bit of snooping on their neighbors. You were told to sign a pledge book saying that you were going to follow the directions of the U.S. Food Administration. You would carry a card with you saying that you were you're obeying the dictates of Hoover and the USFA. People were told to hang this sign in their kitchen window. And folks would go along and knock on neighbors' doors asking, did you sign the pledge book, right? And we might wonder, with all of these posters, all of this propaganda, Helen wants me to go back. Helen, I got to press ahead. I'm going to send you the recording, okay? Are we good? All right. So, Americans were told to follow government advice, but what exactly, specifically, were people being asked to do when you hang up that sign or you sign that card? I'm going to tell you what the U.S. Food Administration wanted Americans to do during World War I. And I want you to tell me, you can just give me like a thumbs up, if this matches the food advice, right, that we're told to follow today. Here it is. Americans were told to avoid eating wheat, fat, and sugar, and to eat much less meat. And they were told to increase their food intake of locally grown fruits and vegetables, of fish, and to eat more whole wheat grains. All right, so tell me, you can like write in the chat or just tell me. Does that sound like the dietary advice we're asked to follow today? 100%, says Tina. No Cheetos, Tina. It's not on the U. That's Herbert Hoover would be mad at you, right? Yeah, you're exactly right. Right. By the way, good job, Richard. I just noticed the chat here. Extra credit for you for figuring out Hoover. Nice job. So yeah, the U.S. Food Administration wanted Americans to do much of what we're told to do today, especially to just, in general, eat less food, right? Reduce portion size. But the reason for this food advice isn't always the same as the rationale today. So for instance, Americans were told in the First World War to avoid sugar, not because it was bad for your waistline, but because in most parts of America, you can't grow sugarcane, okay? Only in far southern Florida. Most Americans have to eat sugar brought in from the Caribbean on ships, and that was the problem because those ships could be better used rather than hauling sugar to American ports. They would be better used sending material and soldiers to the Western Front. So here you have this young woman who's got a fancy hat and she's drinking a sugary soda through a straw, and you can see that In doing that, in drinking this sugar, she's siphoning ships off of this convoy and kind of distracting them from shipping to this storm cloud over here representing Europe. There are different messages in the posters and propaganda when it comes to the U.S. Food Administration. Here's one that emphasizes despair. I think of the people in this photo or this painting here as almost unhuman. You don't really see their faces, and they're kind of distorted with hunger. And then the message, will you eat less wheat, meat, fats, and sugar that we may still send food? So this was a kind of message of desperation. I'm going to show you 4 posters. All right, there's 4 of them. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. And after I'm done, I want you to tell me which of these you think, for you personally, would be most effective at getting you to follow the advice of Hoover and the USFA, right? Putting aside wheat, meat, flour, and eating more, say, cornmeal or oatmeal or things like that. All right, I'm showing you 4. Tell me which one's the most effective. Here we go. Here's the first one. Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Here they all are. Which one do you think would be most effective? Mhm. Okay. When I do this with 30 undergraduate students, it's the same thing. People are all over the map, and that's on purpose, right? I mean, oh, Helen's saying 3. Okay, yeah. If it was me, all right. By the way, what I think is fascinating about this one here, obviously, you see the rainbow, you see the Statue of Liberty. Um, this is aimed directly at immigrants. It's quite a contrast from that hunger one that I showed you. Look how brightly colored it is. With that one, it's all black and white. People, you can barely see their faces. So this is obviously a much more positive picture. But it was printed in multiple languages. So here it is in English. And what's this one? This is Yiddish, by the way. Looks like Hebrew, but it's Yiddish. It's the same text, food will win the war. You came here seeking freedom. You must now help to preserve it. Here we see another contrast. In this one, hunger breeds madness. You see the man standing here with a clenched fist and a torch. He's looking out at this bright, vibrant city in the background. And in the foreground, you notice there's a mother sort of hunched over, and there's a child next to an empty food bowl. And the message here is one of incredible heartbreak. Clearly, this child has died of starvation, and it's as if the man looking out over the city here is going to burn the whole place down because seeing his child die of starvation. And so the message here at the very bottom, it does send this kind of grandiose message to the U.S. Food Administration. America's food must save the world. And this is sort of how Woodrow Wilson, America's president, described the overall mission of the First World War. You might know that he described this as the war to make the world safe for democracy, which is almost elevating this conflict to a religious crusade. Side note, all of these images that I'm showing you here, they're all from the US archives, and I have the identifying numbers if you're curious. My favorite picture, if I was voting in that list of 4, I would vote for this one. I've got this poster hanging in my office. Little Americans, do your bit. Children are the ones that are portrayed in this picture. You see the smiling kid giving the salute, eating his oatmeal. But clearly adults are the intended audience. The idea, if little kids are willing to give up, their breakfast cereals, well, can't we adults, can't we do the same? And this is my son Levi. He made cornbread. And when Nicole introduced me and she mentioned on Sammy's Radio Recipes, he's holding up a copy of this cookbook from 1927. Nicole, how are we doing for time? Are we okay? Do we have like another? This is my like 10-minute mark. Are we all right?
Yep, we are at 1:36 p.m. So
All righty, terrific.
doing pretty good, I
Okay,
think.
so here's another test for you. When I put this on the screen, what was the first thing you noticed? If you're like most people, yes, of course. Yeah, the first thing you notice is this guy with the big headdress, Native American, and you're probably wondering right now, like, what does this have to do with the First World War and food? Answer is absolutely nothing. This was clever marketing. The folks that made this sheet music for this popular song, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, they realized, wait a minute, we could sell a bunch more sheet music if we just like stick another picture on here. Are you really interested in what they would have called Indian war chiefs? If you are, you can buy this one. Don't like that? Well, buy this one if you're into cameras and photography. This was simply just like collecting, I don't know, baseball cards or Pokemon cards or something. But the rest of this picture describes the song itself. And just like that Little Americans Do Your Bit poster, the one with the oatmeal, the way that children are portrayed in this description of how Americans should eat, it changes over time. This was the best-selling song in 1915. In that year, Europeans were fighting each other, but America was watching the war from the sidelines. The US wouldn't enter World War I until 1917, 2 years later. And so this song described what Americans thought about the war and about themselves. You can see in the background, there's these images of war, this cloud here in the background with explosions and soldiers marching with rifles and bayonets. And in the foreground, there's this woman and a boy, although this boy looks like he might be like 25, huddled in front of the fireside. The chorus for this song, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, went like this. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dares to put a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's boy? Before America's entry into World War I, in other words, children were seen as innocent. And you can see at the very top, the song was a mother's plea for peace. Right? We have to keep our children away from the horrors of war, close to our firesides. Fast forward 2 years. Now America has entered World War I. And now the images of children are very different. This was obviously not created by someone who knew the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, right? Because here, the children are following the Pied Piper. In the actual fairy tale story, the Pied Piper eventually, after leading the rats from Hamelin to drown in the river, doesn't get paid by the villagers. And so then he plays another song on his magical flute, and all of the children from the village follow him and drown in the river. So that's where we get the expression, you have to pay the piper. But the message here is not related to the old fairy tale. The message here is that children should join the US School Garden Army. This was a movement for kids to turn their school playgrounds into victory gardens for the war, right? Rip up all the, the playground equipment and plant food for the war effort. There's a complete difference here then, in just a matter of a couple years, from children being symbols of innocence that need to be protected to children being avid promoters, following in the sort of wartime image of Uncle Sam, and doing that by raising food, just like Herbert Hoover would have instructed. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to fast forward through this. I do the same thing, choose which one of these four is most effective, right? But for the sake of time, I'm not going to do that. If you're super curious, I would like nothing more than after this to show you those four pictures, but for the sake of time, I'm going to fast forward to the end. I said that the First World War is like a national blind spot, right? That we, as a nation, don't have as vivid memories of this as we do of, say, the Civil War. And I want to conclude by talking about Well, this is the rail car in which the armistice was signed, November 11th, 1918. At first, we celebrated November 11th as Armistice Day. Now it's Veterans Day. Ever since, there's been an argument of how the winning side, the Allied powers, should react, should treat the losing side, Germany and its allies. The United States, it's worth noting, pays a tremendous price in what was then called the Great War. 117,000 Americans don't come back from France. And there's always been this question of how the United States, how people around the world should remember this. Other countries, by the way, suffer much higher casualties and maybe as a result have much more vivid memories. If you were to be in, say, Great Britain or France or a lot of other European countries on November 11th, you'll see a very different reaction and commemoration. Here's two quotes from two different historians. First one is John Keegan, who calls this a sad, pointless war for which we are still paying the price. Said this was all slaughter and death by the hundreds of thousands for absolutely nothing. The second quote, Hugh Strahan, saying this was emphatically not a war without meaning or purpose. And these folks are eminent historians. If historians had rock stars, and thankfully we don't, right? But if historians had rock stars, these folks would be like in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So if the best-selling historians of the war draw completely opposite conclusions, how should we ordinary people, how should we think about and remember this war? Well, it's worth noting that the United States only belatedly gets around to celebrating the end of the war at all. The US won't celebrate what it calls Armistice Day until 1926. That's almost 10 years after the US goes to war. And as I pointed out earlier, the First World War doesn't really have a national symbol. I mean, right now, if I asked you to imagine the World War II Iwo Jima Memorial, you could probably picture it in your mind's eye. You know, the white statue with the soldiers raising the American flag. But if I asked you to think about a symbol of World War I, you probably couldn't do it. The best that you might be able to come up with was the symbol of the red poppy. And that comes from the writings of a British poet, not an American, a British poet in World War I. So why is that? Well, gradually, the United States is, I think, correcting that imbalance. 117,000 Americans die in this war. And what I think is interesting, I got this from the website of the US Parks Department, and you can see that even in its publicity photo, there's this ladder falling down as if to say, we're still building. It's coming, people. We're going to get it. It's coming. So this is an idea with the reflecting pool. I like that there's a duck, right? And then this mural in the background. It's unfinished, okay? But here's what it will eventually look like. Right, so far from the other symbols, think of like the Washington Monument or the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the Iwo Jima Memorial, like I said. I mean, it's got a much smaller footprint. It was built a lot later. It's still unfinished. I can't think of a more vivid description of how this is a kind of blind spot in our nation. Having said all that, this is a poem from an American writer, Archibald MacLeish, that I think is a good way to end today's talk. I've talked a lot about food and the way people remember food and the way that we sometimes think about food that might not always match historical reality. But I think the most fitting way to end the description of the Great War is from this poem called The Young Dead Soldiers. MacLeish himself was a US soldier in the First World War. And here's what he says. Whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope, or for nothing, we cannot say. It is you who must say this. They say, these are the dead soldiers, they say, we leave you our deaths, give them their meaning. Give them an end to the war and a true peace. Give them a victory that ends the war and a peace afterwards. Give them their meaning. We were young, they say. We have died. Remember us. I think that's the best way I can think of to end these comments. Folks, I did this in 40 minutes, all right? Meaning that we got plenty of time for questions, or if you want me to go back to slides. Please, I'm gonna step out of PowerPoint here, but please, I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, ideas. What do you got?
I was just gonna say I can't think of any specific question, but
Yeah.
I see Tina asked if you could go back to the posters that you skipped.
Oh, sure. Are you okay, Nicole? Are we okay for time?
Yep, we have 20
All right.
minutes.
Here we go. Here we go. Okay. All right. Can you see it all right? All right. All right, great. Okay, so we're gonna do most effective again. Okay, wait, oh, gotta go back, go back, go back, go back, back. Okay, here we go. So these ones are a little different. They're not about food. These are recruiting posters. Side note here. So American men were required by law to register for selective service. This was the first time this was ever done. The U.S. Army raised troops in a different way during World War I than it ever did before, and that is that it used a draft system. So you had to register for the draft, and so imagine that you or brother or husband or something has to register. I'm going to show you 4 posters. Tell me which one would be the most effective in getting you to sign up. Here we go. Number 1. Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Okay, what do we have? Which one's most effective? 3, okay. 3 or 2. 1.
Lori wrote 2.
2,
Sorry.
okay. We literally have 1 for each. My vote would be number 2. Just to go through them pretty quickly. I think someone said number 1. My students often choose this one. Maddie,
I,
you put number 1?
I did. I thought it was visually the most striking.
Yeah. Because it's kind of an optical illusion, right? You don't know whether he's standing alongside the troops or he's on the other side of the window. It's kind of like a play on that perspective. You got the huge flag. And so one side is light. You can see, one side is very bright and vibrant. The other side is very dark. And the guy's face, he's in profile, right? So half of his face is light and half of it's dark. So it really kind of plays up on that idea. Um, that's great. Okay. Number 2, this one's an internet meme. You see this sometimes in your social media post or something. This is the one I would pick. What emotions do you think this one is playing on? What emotions do you think it's playing on? My students almost never pick this because they're all very young. Most of them are parents, right? But I tell them like,
I, I, Tina had an answer. I was also gonna say shame.
shame, 100%. That's exactly right. Yeah, fathers and being the hero, being the leader, the parent of a household. Shame, right? If you don't register for the draft, not now, not next year, but later, you're going to be old. You're going to have kids, and they're going to ask you what you did, and you're going to have to tell them that you were a slacker. And nowadays, we say slacker is just someone who's like, I don't know, a little bit lazy. In World War I, a slacker meant someone who didn't do their patriotic duty, and there were slacker raids. There were these gangs of armed people that would go around to like sporting events, campgrounds, any place where people would get together, and they would ask you, "Show me your draft registration card." And if you couldn't do it, like you left it in your other pair of pants or whatever, you could be beaten. All right, so that's the origin of the term slacker. Great. This one, what historical event is this a reference to? If you saw this, in 1917, you'd know exactly what this was about. It happens in 1915. It's the sinking of the Lusitania. So a German submarine bombs a passenger ship, possibly also a smuggling ship, and 126 Americans are killed, along with about 1,200 others. So there's a mother and her baby that have been killed in this bombing. You can see their hair. It's clearly underwater. So I think the message here, the emotion here is vengeance. If this previous one was shame. This was like avenge the Lusitania. And then there's this one. This is maybe the most famous of all World War I propaganda posters. You see the spiked helmet, right? This is clearly a kind of derogatory reference to Germany. Destroy this mad brute. In the background, okay, in the background you can see the war-torn remnants of Europe. And then just a quick hop skip over the Atlantic Ocean here. You can see that this beast is trampling on America. Okay. Oh yeah, Maisie, you don't have to raise your hand. What's up?
I have
Oh,
another.
Maddie. I'm so sorry. It's Maddie.
It's
Yeah, go
okay.
ahead.
It's okay. I had two kind of questions. One, I mean, he's wearing a hat that says militarism, which kind of
Yep.
implies that that's the danger.
Yeah.
But also, it's funny because King Kong doesn't come out until 1933.
100%. Yeah. This looks like King Kong and Fay Ray, right? But it's I haven't figured out whether the movie drew some inspiration from this famous poster or not.
Probably, I mean, probably,
It
but
had to have, right? It was,
it's
yeah.
also that kind of shorthand. Oh, there it is. Okay, my sound's picking up. It is also kind of that shorthand for barbarism that we don't see as much now, but
Right. Right. I mean, the idea is like dehumanization, right? That we're going to dehumanize the Germans. It's a lot easier to hate them if we think they're like sort of animals. Um, and what about the half-naked woman? What does that represent? Possibly it represents specifically Belgium. I go into this long detail about the Schlieffen Plan and all this, but the idea is that the neutral country of Belgium is invaded by Germany en route to their invasion of Paris. So this could be a reference to Belgium, or it could just be a reference to innocence, to civilization, and an accusation of what we would today call German war crimes. So regardless, there's this emphasis that like Americans are on the side of righteousness. This is, I think it's analogous to the images of food conservation I showed you. You know, Americans have to, valiantly save the world, whether before entry, whether that was through conserving food, or afterwards, whether it's on the battlefield. So I think the take-home point is that these images, the four I showed you before and the four I just have now, here they are, right? They're meant to be complementary. All right, other questions? This is the, okay, 8-minute mark. Okay. Oh, we have, I think, 5 minutes. So
I didn't have any questions, but that first poster also aesthetically makes me think of the 1919 French silent film J'accuse,
oh yeah,
which
sure. Was
is
that the Dreyfus Affair?
no, that was just well, I think it was Abel Gance, I think, who made it,
Oh,
and I
okay,
think he
okay.
redid it later, kind of differently. But
Oh,
no, the original 1919 version was just like anti-war, anti-World War One.
sure.
But it's a really fantastic film. If you can pick up
Okay.
the version, I think it's
Yeah.
on like some random free streaming service, but one that has English subtitles. It's a fantastic
Sure.
film, and that reminds me a lot of
Okay.
like the aesthetics of it. But
Oh, thank you. I'll check it out. All right, folks. I won't belabor this, but I do want to say thanks to Nicole and the folks at Eckley for sponsoring this, and thank you all for listening.